Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when the world was a little more raw, a little more intense. Imagine standing in a medieval village, your feet sinking into the muddy streets, the air thick with the earthy smells of livestock, burning wood, and something else. The scent of death, the smell that ruled the land. It's not the kind of night you're used to, is it? Trust me, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me where you are and what time it is. Let's see how far this journey really goes. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture it. You're standing in the middle of a bustling medieval town, its streets alive with sounds, smells, and sights that modern life has long since forgotten. The houses are squat, made of timber and thatch, and the narrow lanes twist around the marketplace like a maze of half-remembered dreams. The air, thick, heavy. It carries the scent of wood smoke, the sharp tang of animal hides, the sourness of spilled beer and unwashed bodies. You're not just walking through a town. You're walking through the pulse of life itself. But there's something else in the air, something undeniable, a sharpness that clings to the back of your throat. It's not just the earthy smell of a village. This is the smell of sickness, of the plague. Historians still argue whether the Black Death truly changed the way medieval society saw disease, or whether it simply intensified the already existing tension between life and death. But one thing is certain: the Black Death reshaped everything. The way people lived, the way they died, and the way they dealt with the invisible enemy that swept through their villages with a vengeance. The miasma theory was born of this very terror, the idea that bad air, corrupted air, could bring disease. And people? They believed it. You take a deep breath, pressing the bundle of herbs, perhaps lavender, thyme, or rosemary, tightly to your nose, hoping to mask the putrid air. It doesn't work. The smell is everywhere. It's in the very fabric of the village, woven into the stones, the air, the very souls of its people. And as you move through the narrow alleyways, you see the signs of its devastation. Clothes and bedding from the dead are being burned in the distance, and you hear the unmistakable wail of someone lost to the sickness. The smell of burning flesh is mingling with the rotting stench of bodies left too long in the sun. It's not just the smell of death, it's the smell of fear. The Black Death didn't just kill, it destroyed everything it touched, from health to spirit. It was a sickness that was both invisible and inescapable, and the people believed that if they could just protect themselves from the air, they might survive. This is where the plague doctors come in. Their terrifying appearance wasn't for show. Their long, dark robes, wide-brimmed hats, and most horrifying of all, the beaked masks. Those masks weren't just to look intimidating. They were practical. Inside the beak, herbs, dried flowers, vinegar-soaked sponges, anything that might filter out the disease-carrying air. To modern eyes, these doctors look like something out of a nightmare. Walking skeletons with no face, merely a bird-like mask that was the only shield between them and the horrors they faced every day. But to those living through the Black Death, they were seen as a necessary evil, a desperate, if ultimately futile attempt to stave off death. And yet, for all the miasma masks and burning herbs, people kept dying. It's hard to think about, but those attempts to protect themselves against the invisible world of disease were, in the end, nothing more than a fleeting illusion. The plague didn't care if you carried a bundle of dried flowers in your pocket, and it certainly didn't care if you wore a mask made of clay and feathers. It was going to take what it came for. Still, there was an interesting theory in all this: the belief that the overwhelming sensory experience of the plague, the stench, the decay, the miasma, actually influenced how society began to think about public health. Historians still debate whether the trauma of the Black Death led to the development of early quarantine laws, or whether it was merely the helplessness of a population at the mercy of something far beyond their control. Either way, something changed. And that change? It smelled terrible. But you keep walking, stepping carefully over something in the street that could be garbage, or it could be the remains of something that used to be human. You try to hold your breath, but you can't. The stench of sickness, of death, is too strong, too overwhelming. Finally, you reach the edge of town, and for a moment, you think you can escape it. The smell, the death. You step into the fields where, in a better time, the air would be filled with the scent of wet hay, of earth, of fresh grass. But now, it's a mass grave. The earth here has been disturbed so many times that it no longer smells like soil. It smells like decay, like rot. You stop. Overwhelmed, you take a step back. Your stomach rolls. You're not sick, not yet, but you feel something inside you shift. A realization, maybe. You're standing in the middle of death, and for the first time, you understand what it really smells like. It's not poetic. It's not dramatic. It's sticky, putrid, and all-consuming. It's the smell of survival, of the world trying to hold on, even as it slips into the blackness. And now, as you lie in your bed at night, you can still smell it, even though the world outside is quiet. Your clothes still carry the scent of the day, the stench of the village, the plague, and the fear. But you close your eyes, press your herbs to your face, and hope, somehow, that sleep will take you away from it all, and in the morning, it will still be there. The disease, the fear, and the smell. Especially the smell. As the sun rises the next morning, the stench hasn't shifted. It still clings to you like a second skin, but you don't have the luxury of dwelling on it. You've learned to live with it, the same way people in the village have learned to live with the fact that death is now a part of their everyday life. And for some, that means trying to protect themselves in whatever way they can. You step into the town square, where the streets are emptier than usual. People have learned not to stand too close. But it's not just fear of infection that makes them keep their distance. It's the plague doctors. You've seen them before. Those strange, almost terrifying figures that stalk the streets like they belong in a nightmare. But as unnerving as they are, you can't help but feel a strange sense of relief when you spot one. The plague doctor, with his long, dark robes and wide-brimmed hat, is unmistakable. The beaked mask is the most defining feature. It looks like something from a horror story, something designed to keep you awake at night. It's made of leather, black and foreboding, with a long, curved beak that juts out like the very essence of death itself. But inside that beak, They stuffed herbs, dried flowers, vinegar-soaked sponges, anything they thought might filter the bad air that carried disease. You wonder, as you watch one of them carefully moving through the town, if they really believe it works. There's a part of you that wants to believe it does, that maybe the mask can stop the plague from reaching you. After all, these doctors are trying something. They're acting like they can fight back against the invisible threat. Historians still argue whether these doctors were just well-meaning but misinformed, or whether their efforts actually had any effect on limiting the spread of disease. Either way, they're doing their best to try. But it's hard not to laugh at the sight. To modernize, they look ridiculous. Walking air purifiers with the frightening look of death on their faces. But in their time, these beaked figures were considered protectors. It wasn't just a costume. It was their armor against something unseen, a physical representation of hope against the hopelessness of the plague. But let's be real, their logic was flawed. The idea that you could avoid catching the disease by not smelling it? Well, spoiler alert, it didn't work. Still, you have to give them credit for creativity. They didn't have much to work with, and what else could they do but try to cover their noses and hope for the best? You might chuckle, but you also understand the desperation. When a plague like this ravages a town, what other choice do you have but to grasp at anything, no matter how absurd it might seem? As you move through the square, past the doctors with their beaked masks, you can't help but notice the other people around you. They all seem to be reacting the same way. Some stare, others glance away in unease, while a few seem to silently nod in approval. People around here don't question the doctors. In times like these, you have to cling to whatever semblance of control you can find. It's not just the doctors, though. The entire town is full of strange measures taken in the face of an invisible, deadly enemy. People have started hanging bundles of herbs on their doors, hanging garlic cloves from their windows, anything they can do to fend off the plague. And as weird as it sounds, there's something about all of it. The masks, the herbs, the frantic measures that makes you feel like you're in a place that's halfway between the rational and the irrational. But it's real. This is survival. You make your way to the edge of the square, where the last remnants of the previous night's festival are still lingering. Even though the town is somber and the air thick with disease, people are trying to go on with their lives. There's a strange mix of defiance and despair in the air. The plague isn't just affecting the sick, it's affecting everyone. But some people, in their fear, have started to push back. They've begun to build walls, both literal and metaphorical, between themselves and the threat. But there's a limit to what the human spirit can bear, and it's hard to not feel the weight of it all as you walk further into the town. Even the fresh air outside isn't as refreshing as it should be. It's tinged with something. It smells like illness. And even though the plague doctors are doing their best to fight back, you can't escape it. Historians still debate whether the obsession with the plague smell did more harm than good. Some argue that it pulled attention away from more effective measures, like quarantine or killing rats. Others believe it reshaped public health, setting the groundwork for things like cleaner city planning and early quarantine laws. But the truth is, the obsession with stench isn't just about avoiding disease. it's a psychological response too. The smell of death in the air doesn't just make you sick, it makes you feel sick. It's the invisible weight on your shoulders and the heavy burden of the plague that no one can escape. So, as you continue walking through the town, you can't help but wonder, will it ever get better? Can the plague ever truly be stopped? And more importantly, will you survive it? The day drags on as you step through the town, the ground beneath your boots squelching with every step. The plague doctors have retreated, their dark figures blending into the shadows of the alleys as you pass. You wonder if they believe in their work, or if it's all just a way to cope with the overwhelming chaos. But regardless of their belief, the smell lingers, thick and pungent in the air. You make your way out of the town, heading toward the fields that once smelled of hay and fresh dew. But today, the earth has been turned, the air has changed, and so has the smell. You pause, your stomach churning, as you take in the sight of the temporary graves. The earth beneath your feet no longer holds the scent of soil. It reeks of something else, of decay. The plague is here, and it's claimed its victims. And with each grave dug, another layer of hope is buried beneath the dirt. The fields once promised life, the scent of fresh hay in the spring air. But now, they are full of the dead. Rows upon rows of hastily dug graves, the bodies of your neighbors and loved ones, those whose names you won't be able to remember for much longer, lie beneath the ground. The reality sets in, and it hits harder than any fever or cough ever could. This is what death smells like, and you can't run from it. You bend down, trying to avoid the sight of the fresh mounds, but you can't help it. There's a strange sensation of nausea creeping up from your stomach, like it's trying to force its way out of you, but you hold it back. The smell, the stench of rotting flesh and the too soon, all-consuming nature of death is overwhelming. You can't escape it, no matter how many herbs you stuff into your nose, no matter how many masks you wear. Historians still argue about how the Black Death influenced medieval responses to public health. Some say it led to early quarantine laws and even cleaner city planning, while others believe the constant fear of disease and the obsession with scent distracted people from the more effective measures that could have been taken, like isolating the sick or eradicating rats. But no matter which side of the debate you fall on, one thing is clear. The plague brought a permanent change to the world. The stench of death was an undeniable presence in every corner of society. As you continue walking, you find yourself at the edge of the town, looking out over the fields. The air here is still thick with the remains of the past. It's a bitter reminder that life is fragile, and all around you, death is just waiting to take its next victim. Your throat tightens as you inhale deeply, the air heavy with the pungent scent of rot. It's impossible to escape. You can't outrun it. Your clothes are already saturated with the stench, your body too. It's a part of you now, just as much as the fear that twists your gut. You are one of the living, but you walk among the dead, and there's nothing to separate you from them, except the beating of your heart and the shallow breath in your lungs. You know you're not sick. Not yet. But something in the pit of your stomach tells you it's coming. The plague is a ticking clock, and you can hear it now, loud and clear. Your eyes dart around, but there's no one else in sight. The town is too quiet, too still, In the distance, you hear a faint sound, like the low hum of a bell. But when you look around, you see nothing. It's the sound of the dead, the sound of a village that has already begun to mourn. Even now, as the bodies of the freshly departed are being laid to rest, there's no peace, there's no reprieve, just a deep, hollow fear. You swallow hard, your heart pounding in your chest as you glance down at the ground. The earth here, once rich and fertile, now feels foreign. The smell, the sights, the very air, all of it is a harsh reminder of the fragility of life. You try to push the thoughts away, but they linger, gnawing at the edges of your mind. The truth sinks in. You don't know who will be next. You don't know if tomorrow will bring the same fate. There's no way of telling. All you can do is try to survive for as long as you can. But even survival comes with a price. The stench of death is everywhere, and it's the only thing you can't escape. As you turn away, walking back toward the village, you wonder if any of this will ever end. Will it be like this forever? With death lurking just around the corner, always waiting, always there? You don't know. But one thing is certain, the smell of death will never leave. Not in this town, not in this world. Imagine walking into a grand medieval castle, the kind with high arched ceilings and banners fluttering in the breeze. The majestic hall is filled with nobles enjoying their feasts, their laughter echoing through the stone walls. It all feels so regal, so refined, until you catch a whiff of something foul. You turn your head, and suddenly, it's everywhere. The smell of decay, the thick, rancid air. You realize that all this grandeur, this majesty, is built on a foundation of filth. The source of this unpleasant odor is a strange and somewhat horrifying feature of medieval castles, the guardrobe. Sounds posh, doesn't it? The kind of place where a nobleman might store his finest silks and perfumes. But no, it's much more practical. A guardrobe was, in fact, the castle's toilet, a hole in the wall that often emptied directly into the moat below. Imagine it, a seat perched above a dark, damp pit, sometimes with a wooden bench, sometimes with stone, and always with an awful smell. It wasn't just a room tucked away for privacy. The very air around you swirled with the stench of human waste and decomposition. Historians still argue whether these guardrobes were as common as the records suggest, or whether they've been exaggerated by later writers. Some believe they were more of a luxury, while others argue that this was the fate of most medieval castles, with no better solutions in sight. What is agreed upon is that the smell from these lavatories would have permeated the entire castle. The very idea of sitting in a room with a seat perched above a pit, surrounded by the odors of countless others, must have been intolerable. But for the people living in these castles, it was just a part of life. You can only imagine how this must have felt. Sitting at a grand feast in the great hall, perhaps laughing and enjoying yourself, but knowing that just a short distance away, the stench of human excrement was building up in the castle's guardrobes. These toilets were rarely cleaned, and the pit would only be emptied when the smell became unbearable. Though that was a matter of subjective opinion, some castles even had multiple guardrobes, stacking the waste from different levels on top of each other, creating a medieval equivalent of a sewage system. It wasn't much of a system at all, though. No pipes, no plumbing, and certainly no solution to the ever-present, ever-growing smell. as you walk through the stone halls, you might not be able to escape the sense that there is a hidden world beneath you, one of dirt and disease, and a continuous, unyielding stench that no amount of wealth or power could hide. Nobles, of course, didn't clean their own guardrobes. That task fell to the night soil men, servants who were either underpaid or perhaps even paid in gratitude for their labor, a job that was neither prestigious nor pleasant. These workers were the unsung heroes, or rather, unsung sufferers, of the castle's hygienic efforts. At least once a year, the accumulated waste would be dumped, typically in a nearby river or forest, a disgusting reminder of the need to deal with waste, but also a reminder of the unfortunate few who had to bear the responsibility. And yet, even if you managed to avoid the guardrobe itself, there was no escaping the stench in the air. Castles were massive, drafty, and crammed with people. Cooks, musicians, servants, knights, and visiting dignitaries. The great halls may have looked grand, but in reality, they were large, open spaces filled with the sweat and body odor of 100 people, each contributing to the overpowering scent that hung thick in the air. The smell of roasting meat, the unwashed bodies, the lingering smoke from the hearths, it all combined into one overwhelming scent that defined medieval living. Picture it, a banquet hall with roasted meat on the spit, spilled wine, and a mixture of human sweat, body odor, and the faint scent of stale bread. The rich tapestries hanging on the walls, they might have looked magnificent, but those same walls trapped the heat, the smoke, and the scent of unwashed bodies. You're eating with your hands, grabbing greasy platters, passing the food to the next person, and wiping your hands on your sleeves that are likely just as dirty as the rest of your clothes. The idea of cleanliness in the grand halls of a medieval castle was a luxury few could afford. But it didn't stop there. In some castles, the wealthy would store their clothes near the guardrobe because the ammonia from the urine helped to keep moths away. Yes, you heard that right. The very smell that made your stomach turn was used as a practical method for protecting expensive clothing. So not only was the guardrobe a source of foulness, but it was also a practical space, serving double duty in a way that would horrify modern sensibilities. Even the wealthy couldn't escape the reality of living in a time when hygiene and sanitation were secondary to other, more pressing concerns. Some castles even had multiple levels of guardrobes, with waste dropping from one level to the next, creating what could only be described as a medieval sewage system. But without the proper infrastructure to manage the waste, and when the pits became unbearable, the night soil men would do their job, emptying the accumulated waste into nearby woods or rivers, a solution that may have been effective for the moment, but far from ideal. As a noble living in one of these castles, you might have been able to avoid the guardrobe for a while, but eventually, the reality would hit you. You would have to face the smell, the filth, and the knowledge that no matter how grand the castle might seem, it was built on a foundation of waste and neglect. The guards would stand sentinel, the musicians would play, and the banquets would continue. But there would always be the knowledge that beneath the surface, there was a reality of decay that could not be ignored. Now, let's turn our attention to something even more bizarre about medieval life. The fact that people, quite literally, became nose-blind to the overwhelming smells around them. Imagine it. A town bustling with activity, the air thick with the smell of animal waste, rotten meat, unwashed bodies, and everything in between. You've braved the streets, where the scent of death and decay is as familiar as the cobblestones underfoot, and the very idea of cleanliness feels like a distant dream. But for the people living in this world, none of that stench felt extraordinary. It was just Tuesday. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly desensitized to smells, or whether they just had a different relationship with their environment. Some suggest that the people of the time were so immersed in their stench-filled world that their brains learned to filter out the unpleasant smells as background noise. After all, they lived in a time with no plumbing, no sanitation, and a whole lot of dirt. But what's truly baffling is how they didn't seem to notice, or at least didn't act like they noticed, when things began to rot, until it was dangerously late. Imagine you're a child born into a medieval village. From the moment you take your first breath, you're inhaling the same air as the livestock, the waste in the streets, and the smoky refuse from the neighboring homes. Your world smells of urine, feces, and sweat. And by the time you're 6 years old, you've stepped over enough rats and decaying animals to make most modern people gag. And yet, for you, this is normal. It's the baseline for your existence. It's home. By the time you're 16, you've grown up surrounded by the smell of blood, dung, rotting food, and disease. You're not grossed out by the smell of wet wool or the faint odor of the butcher stall still clinging to your clothes after a day's work. You probably don't even notice the underlying scent of decay that permeates every street, every room, and every market stall. What would make you gag? The smell of a garbage heap or spoiled meat just doesn't register. Your nose has adapted. Now picture walking into a crowded room, maybe a tavern after a long day of work, or the local church on a holy day. The room is filled with the heat of bodies, the smell of ale and unwashed clothing, and the faint scent of damp straw lining the floor. For you, this is the scent of life. Sure, it's unpleasant at times, but it's not new. It's not alarming. The air you breathe might smell like death, but that's all you've ever known. Historians debate whether this nose blindness helped or hindered the medieval world's response to disease. In a time when miasma, the belief that bad air or foul smells caused illness, was the leading medical theory, it would have been difficult to identify when an outbreak of disease was starting to spread. The air was always bad. The streets always smelled of rot. Without a clear reference point, how could you tell when the situation had escalated? How could you recognize the signs of plague when every corner of town smelled equally foul? And yet, medieval people didn't just accept bad smells. They assigned meaning to them. Good smells were considered a sign of virtue, health, or even divinity, while foul smells were often linked to corruption, sin, or disease. The belief that unpleasant odors could be a sign of moral decay or demonic influence was widespread. People believed that if a place smelled too bad, it could be cursed or contaminated by evil spirits. In contrast, saints and holy figures were often believed to emit pleasant fragrances, even after death, an odor that was taken as proof of their divine favor. It wasn't just about death or disease either. Smells had social weight. A well-groomed noble might dab a little lavender or rose water on their sleeves, while a poor peasant likely stank of sweat, animal dung, and the smells of the countryside. As a result, your social status could often be identified by the scent that clung to you. Nobles, even as they fought to manage their personal hygiene, would have been far more attuned to the need to keep their personal scents in check, while peasants, whose lives were so far removed from the concept of privacy or cleanliness, didn't have the luxury of worrying about it. Historians still debate whether medieval people were fully aware of their filthy environment, or whether they simply lived in it with an uncanny sense of normalcy. The evidence is mixed. Some records show that medieval citizens were aware of unpleasant smells when traveling to different regions, with merchants commenting on the foul air in inland cities, or religious pilgrims noting the particularly rank scent of livestock and human waste in holy places. The difference between home and foreign smells might have been more noticeable to outsiders, but for the people living in the thick of it, the stench was simply a part of life. At the same time, medieval cities and towns had some awareness of the importance of fresh air and ventilation, even if they lacked the knowledge to make it truly effective. Some wealthier homes and religious buildings were equipped with rudimentary chimneys, flues, and other ventilation methods to try and direct the unpleasant smells away from living areas. But this was a far cry from the modern systems of air purification we have today. Most medieval homes had no plumbing, no sanitation, and little in the way of ventilation. Just a few windows, often covered with shutters, or simply cracked open when the weather allowed. Now picture yourself walking through a medieval city. You've gotten used to the smell, the constant assault on your senses, but that doesn't make it easier. As you pass a butcher's stall, the stench of raw meat and spilled blood fills your nostrils. You try not to breathe it in, but it's impossible. You cross over a street full of manure and rotting vegetables, and the stench clings to you like a shadow. It's not a smell you can outrun, not a smell you can escape. For you, the journey of survival in a medieval world isn't just about dodging sickness and danger. It's about living with the smell, living through it, and ultimately, it's about accepting it as part of your reality. The stench doesn't go away. It never does. It becomes part of your skin, part of your soul, and you learn to ignore it, or at least, you learn to live with it. You're walking through a medieval town when you catch sight of something strange. A figure wrapped head to toe in a long, dark robe, their face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The whole ensemble designed to protect them from the very air around them. It's a plague doctor, one of the few individuals who dared enter the homes of the infected, carrying the weight of the town's fate in their hands. And yet, they look like something out of a nightmare. Those infamous beaked masks were more than just a costume, more than just an accessory. They were designed with a singular purpose: to filter the miasma, the foul air believed to carry disease. The beak of the mask was stuffed with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and sometimes even vinegar-soaked sponges. The theory, such as it was, held that these substances could purify the air and protect the doctor from the disease. While we now know that diseases like the plague were spread by bacteria carried by fleas, not by the air itself, the plague doctors were trying to do the best they could with the knowledge at hand, even if it meant wearing something that made them appear more like a bird of death than a healer. Historians still argue whether plague doctors were ever truly effective in stemming the tide of the Black Death. Some maintain that the entire practice of wearing these ridiculous masks was rooted in superstition, a misguided attempt to protect oneself from invisible threats. Others believe that in the absence of any real medical understanding, the doctors were, in a way, doing what they could to at least offer a sense of control, even if their treatments were little more than a placebo. But despite the mask's failings, there's something undeniably inventive about the whole concept. The beaked mask, in a strange way, was a kind of early air purifier. And while it wasn't grounded in science, it was an attempt to respond to the overwhelming terror of the time. For the medieval people, who were trapped in a world filled with the stench of death, disease, and decay, the idea that something, anything, could protect them from the invisible forces that killed so many was, perhaps, the best answer they had. You find yourself imagining what it must have been like for these doctors. They were the ones who had to look disease in the eye and keep going. As terrifying as their appearance was, these doctors were often the only hope for families facing death. They carried herbs and medicines, even if those were largely ineffective, and performed rudimentary treatments like bloodletting or applying poultices. But it wasn't just their medical knowledge that made them notable. It was their courage to enter homes already ravaged by plague, knowing full well the risk they were taking. The very sight of one of these doctors walking through the streets with their mask and gown must have been both terrifying and oddly comforting. For a time, they represented the last line of defense between life and death. As you walk through this medieval town, the smell is almost unbearable. The streets are filled with the sick, the dead, and those who are trying their best to avoid both. The miasma hangs heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the plague's deadly reach. You can feel it in your lungs, the oppressive, rancid air filling your chest with every breath. As you pass a group of townsfolk, someone offers you a bundle of herbs, lavender, rosemary, thyme, hoping it will mask the smell. But you know, deep down, that there's no escaping it. This is the world you live in now. Now picture yourself entering a house where a plague doctor has just made their rounds. The stench inside is overwhelming, a mixture of sickness, death, and the heavy, cloying scent of herbs. You step carefully around the sick, trying not to touch anything, feeling a sense of unease that even the pungent herbs can't wash away. The doctor has already done their work, and there's little left to do now, except wait. Historians still debate whether the use of herbal remedies and perfumes in medieval times was rooted more in superstition or practical necessity. While some remedies may have had some minor effectiveness in alleviating symptoms, others were purely symbolic, designed to offer comfort or create the illusion of protection. But what's fascinating is the extent to which these beliefs shaped medical practices. The reliance on scent, on the idea that smells could either protect or harm you, was a central feature of medieval life. And yet, in some strange way, it makes sense. If you were living in a world where disease seemed to strike without warning, where death could come at any moment, wouldn't you want to believe that there was something, anything, that could protect you? The medieval mindset, driven by fear, superstition, and a lack of medical understanding, sought comfort in the belief that the right combination of smells, the right herbs, or even a mask could stave off death. As you leave the house and step back into the street, the smell of plague still clings to the air. It's everywhere. On the people, in the buildings, in the very streets you walk. You can't escape it. But you do your best to move on, to keep breathing. Because what else can you do? In a world where disease is a constant companion, where death is always just a breath away, survival is a matter of trying, of adapting, of accepting what you can't control. In this world of sickness, superstition, and creativity, you begin to see how deeply the plague shaped medieval society. The response to the disease wasn't just medical, it was cultural, psychological, and social. It changed how people viewed health, death, and the very air they breathed. You've now found yourself in the heart of a grand medieval castle, its towering walls scraping the sky. Banners hang, fluttering in the wind as you walk through the great hall, filled with nobles feasting and brooding portraits on the walls. The air is thick with the scent of roasting meat, freshly poured wine, and something else. Something that you can't quite place yet, but is certainly pervasive. As you venture deeper into the castle, you learn the truth behind the aristocracy's hidden scent. Castles, despite their grandeur, were plagued by a unique brand of funk, centered around one often overlooked feature: the garderobe. It sounds fancy, right? A wardrobe, a place for storing fine silks and perfumes. But no, in medieval castles, a garderobe was simply the castle's toilet, a glorified hole in the wall, often without privacy, that emptied directly into the moat, or, worse, into a shared pit beneath the castle. Historians still argue about how common these garderobes were across castles. Some say they were the norm, widely used and terribly unpleasant. Others suggest that many castles had cleaner, more modern solutions like chamber pots, and the garderobes were only reserved for the more rustic estates. What's undeniable, however, is that the scent from these medieval toilets was absolutely unbearable. The waste, collected from multiple levels of the castle, would descend into an open pit or drop straight into the moat below. It's hard to imagine now, but in those days, this was considered a relatively advanced form of sewage disposal. No pipes, no plumbing, and often no plan to keep the smell from wafting through the hallways. In fact, the scent from these toilets would travel through the castle, often mixing with the aromas of roasting meats, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present stench of sweat, manure, and mud from the horses stabled in nearby rooms. But let's get into the nitty-gritty of these royal facilities. The seats of the garderobes were crude affairs, usually wooden benches with a hole in the middle. Some castles had multiple garderobes built vertically, meaning waste from each floor would drop down into a single pit below. This created a truly horrifying medieval equivalent of a sewer system, though one without the luxury of running water or any real means of clearing it away. The worst part? The garderobes weren't always enclosed. Sometimes the bathroom was simply an open hole positioned off a hallway or tucked into a small side chamber. The smell of decomposing waste would mingle with the air, making it difficult to even breathe. And even when it was enclosed, it did little to keep the stench contained. Picture yourself walking past such a place. You can't help but wrinkle your nose, trying not to breathe through your nostrils. But it's impossible. The air is thick with the scent of human waste, the smell lingering on your clothes long after you've passed by. Now, imagine the nobles of the time. aristocrats living in this grandeur, yet unable to escape the filth beneath their feet. The guard-robes didn't just stink, they were dangerous. Falling into the waste pits was a real hazard, particularly when the castle was packed with guests. Some unlucky souls, intoxicated by wine or misfortune, fell into these pits, met their untimely deaths, and were remembered not for their valor, but for their tragic and aromatic exit from life. Historians still argue whether castles were as unsanitary as many records suggest. Were the aristocracy really living in filth? Or were these accounts exaggerated by later writers? Some maintain that the castles were actually quite clean, and that the worst of the smells came from the peasantry. Others argue that the royal courts were no better, and that nobles, much like their subjects, had to suffer through the same unsanitary conditions. You, a guest in the castle, continue your exploration. You walk past the great hall where the noblemen continue their feasts, and you can't help but notice the overpowering heat in the room. The air feels thick, heavy with the smoke of the roaring fires, the body odors of men who have been sitting in the same clothes all day, and the faint aroma of cooking meat that permeates everything. The castle may look grand, but there's no escaping the reality of the daily life within its walls. The smell of the guard-robes, combined with the heat, the body odors, and the constant presence of animals, creates an atmosphere of discomfort and unrest. Even the noblewomen, who might spend hours dressing in lavish gowns, can't avoid the stench. They walk across stone floors and sit beside their husbands, their clothing still carrying the faint smell of the guard-robe. But the smells don't end there. Some castles had more elaborate guard-robes, complete with padded seats and even a window for air circulation. But these were rare. Most were simple wooden benches, perched over a hole in the wall. And while the nobles may have been shielded from the worst of the squalor that surrounded them, they weren't free from the pervasive smell of waste. There's something morbidly fascinating about how they dealt with it all. Some castles, particularly the wealthier ones, employed night soilmen, servants tasked with emptying the waste pits when the smell became unbearable. The frequency of these cleanings depended on the castle's size, the number of guests, and the general condition of the pit. If it wasn't emptied soon enough, the smell would become unbearable, and even the richest nobles would be forced to endure the stench until it could be cleaned. Sometimes, the waste was dumped directly into nearby rivers or forests, spreading the problem to the surrounding land. The castles of medieval Europe were, in a way, an epitome of both grandeur and filth. They were the height of aristocratic life, yet they also housed some of the most unsanitary living conditions imaginable. The guard-robes, the open sewers, and the lack of basic hygiene were a constant reminder of the contrast between the nobility's wealth and their actual daily reality. In the grand halls, you could almost forget the filth until the smell hit. You could lose yourself in the music, the wine, and the laughter of the feast. But deep down, you knew the truth. The same stones that housed the finest tapestries, the wealthiest men, and the most beautiful women also held the rotting remains of the past, quietly decaying beneath your feet. As you step away from the banquet hall, the sounds of the feast fading behind you, you can't help but think. For all the grandeur and riches, the smell never quite leaves. It lingers, reminding you that even in the most majestic castles, there was always something a little less than perfect, something that no amount of money or power could conceal. Now, as you wander through this medieval world, you begin to understand the remarkable ways people adapted to the overwhelming smells of their daily lives. The stench of disease, human waste, spoiled food, and unwashed bodies surrounded them everywhere they went. Yet somehow, they didn't seem to notice it as much as you do. Your nose, still fresh and unaccustomed to this harsh environment, is assaulted at every turn. But to them, it was just Tuesday. Historians still argue about how much medieval people were aware of the smell around them. Did they truly ignore it, or had they simply grown immune? The truth is, medieval life was a sensory overload, and people learned to adapt to it in ways that are hard for us to fathom today. They were raised in an environment where poor hygiene, decaying food, and the constant presence of animal waste were a normal part of life. Imagine, if you will, a child born into this world. The moment they are born, they are thrust into an atmosphere saturated with the scent of sweat, hay, and animal dung. They grow up in houses that have no plumbing, no refrigeration, and no sanitation. Their daily life is filled with the smells of decay, and they learn from a very young age to live with it. By the time they reach adulthood, they have become completely desensitized to the stench of their surroundings. As you step deeper into this medieval village, you start to feel the shift in your own perception. At first, your senses were on high alert, recoiling at every unpleasant smell. But over time, you begin to notice that the stench no longer strikes you as jarring. It becomes background noise, like the sound of wind rustling through the trees or the hum of distant voices. It's not that you like it. It's just that you've become accustomed to it. Your body, like theirs, has started to ignore the things that once repelled you. This phenomenon, known as nose blindness, was a survival mechanism of sorts. Historians still debate whether people in the Middle Ages truly lived in such a state of ignorance about their hygiene, or whether they simply lacked the words and the cultural framework to recognize the severity of the conditions they lived in. Either way, the fact remains, people lived in a world of constant sensory assault, and they had no choice but to adapt. In a sense, this desensitization made life bearable. When every breath you take is filled with the smell of rotting meat, spoiled fish, and human waste, it becomes just another part of life. It's no longer shocking. It's just normal, and the longer you live in it, the less you notice it. But of course, there were moments when the stench would rise above the baseline, when something went so far beyond the ordinary that it became unbearable. When a body lay rotting for days in the street, or when a plague outbreak ravaged a neighborhood, the smell would hit with a sharpness that even the most nose-blind medieval person couldn't ignore. In these cases, the smells would signal something far worse than mere discomfort, something deadly. The very air around them became a warning. As you walk through the village, you realize that your growing immunity to the stench is not something to celebrate. It's a sign of just how far the world has gone wrong, how the constant exposure to filth and decay has affected the very way people perceive their surroundings. And it's not just the smell of disease that has become normalized. It's the smell of death itself. Now, let's shift your focus to something more immediate. You pass by a butcher's stall, the air thick with the scent of freshly slaughtered animals. The meat is hanging on hooks, flies buzzing around it, their tiny bodies adding to the ever-present swarm of life and death that surrounds you. You've smelled this before. You've seen this process take place countless times in your own life. The slaughtering, the cleaning, the preparation. It's not pleasant, but it's necessary. You have to eat. You have to survive. And here, in the heart of medieval life, survival often meant pushing through discomfort. You can't stop the smell of decay, so you learn to accept it. You can't stop the filth of the streets, the waste piling up at every corner. But you can learn to navigate it, to move through the world without letting it consume you. That's the reality for these people. In the more affluent parts of the village, where the nobles live, there are attempts to keep the smells at bay. In their grand halls, where lavish feasts are held and nobles gather to discuss matters of state, the air is heavy with incense, perfume, and herbs. The wealthy at least can afford to mask the smell. But even their lives are not entirely free from the stench of their surroundings. The castles, though grand and imposing, still have their share of odors. The thick stone walls trap the heat, the smoke, and the odors of bodies, food, and waste. The perfumes and incense can only do so much to cover it up. In fact, as you continue your journey through the village, you begin to understand that there's no escaping it. The stench is everywhere. In the streets, in the homes, in the places of worship, in the feasts and the markets. It clings to everything. And yet, the people here continue on with their lives, adapting to their circumstances and making do with what they have. As you reflect on all this, you realize that the medieval world wasn't just about surviving disease or war. It was about surviving the constant assault on the senses. It was about learning to live in a world that smelled of death, decay, and disease, and still finding a way to move forward. You step into the shadowy streets of the medieval town, where fear grips the air as tightly as the plague itself. The Black Death is sweeping through the land, its chilling touch felt in every corner of the village. The very thought of it sends a shiver down your spine. You've heard the whispers. Families are falling ill in droves. Whole households wiped out in days. The town is cloaked in an aura of death and dread. But it's not just the sickness that haunts the people here. It's the smell. The miasma, the invisible, diseased air, is believed to be the culprit. And it is a constant presence. To fight it, the town has turned to the infamous plague doctors, those strange, beak-masked figures that haunt the streets like walking nightmares. At first glance, you might think they are here to bring death, not fight it. But no, these figures, dressed in long, dark robes and wide-brimmed hats, are the town's last line of defense against a threat they can't even understand. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these doctors' strange attire. Some argue that the beaked masks, stuffed with herbs and soaked sponges, were an early attempt at hygiene. Primitive air purifiers meant to filter the toxic vapors believed to carry the disease. Others believe they were merely symbolic, a futile gesture in the face of a disease they couldn't comprehend. Either way, these doctors became a symbol of the era's desperate struggle against an invisible enemy. You watch as one of the doctors walks past you, his eyes obscured by the dark lenses of his mask, his robe trailing behind him. He carries a long staff, and you notice a bundle of herbs hanging from his belt. The smell of lavender, thyme, and vinegar mixes with the scent of death in the air. And you wonder, can he even smell it? Or is he too accustomed to it by now? As he moves past, you notice the strange logic behind his appearance. The beaked mask, filled with aromatic herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges, was meant to protect the wearer from the bad air that was thought to carry the plague. But the more you think about it, the more absurd it seems. How could herbs and vinegar protect against something so powerful? Surely, the disease would find a way in, no matter how many flowers you stuffed into a mask. It's a hot debate among scholars even today. Could the beaked masks have offered any real protection against the Black Death? Or were they just an attempt to create a sense of control in a world on the brink of collapse? What we do know is that they were a response to the overwhelming fear of the unknown. The people of the time didn't understand germs or viruses, but they knew that something invisible and deadly was lurking in the air. They needed something to help them fight it, even if it was just a symbol of hope. You can't help but feel a strange sense of sympathy for these doctors. They weren't merely walking death omens. They were people caught in the same web of fear and confusion as the rest of the population. They had to put on these masks, walk into the houses of the sick, and attempt to find a cure that didn't exist. Their job was to face death head-on, not knowing whether they themselves would make it through the day. But the real horror of it all, as you walk through the town, is the overwhelming stench that clings to the air. It's more than just the smell of death. It's the scent of a world unraveling. The plague doctors may have been trying to filter the air, but no mask could protect against the hopelessness that had set in. The very air seemed to carry with it the weight of impending doom. As you pass a group of villagers huddled together in fear, you overhear their conversation. They're discussing the plague, the smell, and the actions of the doctors. One man argues that the herbs and vinegar were helping. After all, no one could deny that the doctors had been visible in the streets, trying to maintain order. But another woman counters, pointing out that the death toll continues to rise. No mask, no matter how many herbs you stuff into it, could stop the plague. The real solution, she says, is to isolate the sick, to keep them away from the healthy. But no one had the resources or knowledge to make that happen on a large scale. As the debate rages on around you, you find yourself thinking back to the smell. The miasma, they called it. The bad air that carried death. The more you inhale it, the more you understand. It's not just the smell of death. It's the smell of a society that had no answers, no control, and no way of fighting back against a disease that was sweeping through the population. It's the smell of a time that didn't have the tools to fight back, not just against the plague itself, but against the fear that paralyzed everyone who lived through it. And yet, life goes on. The villagers continue with their daily routines, albeit with a sense of urgency and fear. They go to market, they go to church, they try to go about their lives as best they can. Some have already succumbed to the disease, their bodies lying in the streets as reminders of what could happen to anyone. Others seem to have accepted their fate, knowing that the air itself could carry the disease to them at any moment. You can't help but feel a sense of despair as you walk through this town. The plague doctors, with their strange beaked masks and aromatic herbs, are doing their best to fight an enemy they don't understand. But in the end, the plague is a force too powerful for anyone to truly control. All they can do is try to hold back the tide of death for a little while longer. As you continue your journey, the smell of the town, the smell of death, disease, and decay clings to you. You press your handkerchief to your face, but it does little to filter the air. The stench is everywhere. And as you think about it, you realize that this is what life is like in the Middle Ages, a constant battle against the unseen forces of nature, with only the faintest hopes of survival. You've made your way into the towering stone walls of a medieval castle, the imposing turrets rising high above you. Inside, everything feels regal. The grand halls, the tapestries, the feasts. And yet, there's an undeniable truth about castle life that no amount of luxury can hide. You've heard rumors of the guard robes, the royal lavatories, and you're now about to experience the medieval take on personal hygiene. The truth behind this castle innovation is far from the romanticized idea of noble nobility. In the vast, drafty halls, the aristocracy often ate and slept in the same areas where they lived, meaning that private spaces were rare. So, when it came time to relieve themselves, they didn't have the convenience of plumbing or even a secluded toilet area. Instead, they had guard robes. Literally, a hole in the wall. You pause, your mind grappling with the grim concept. A small wooden seat placed over a shaft or pit, often positioned in the hallways or other public spaces. The waste would drop into a pit below, or even directly into the moat. Historians argue whether this was an acceptable form of sanitation, or if it was just another architectural disaster of medieval living. Some think these guard robes were perhaps necessary given the times. There was no sewage system to rely on, and certainly no flush toilets. They were simply a way of dealing with the very real problem of bodily waste in a society that had no better solution. However, others argue that such a foul-smelling, unsanitary method of waste disposal should never have been acceptable. You move closer to examine one of the castle's guard robes. The stone walls seem too sturdy for a mere hole in the ground, but the smell of the pit reaches you, even from this distance. Imagine it, a steady stream of waste from each level of the castle, collected in an open trench or a pit below. The smell would have been unbearable, especially when you factor in the heat of summer, the constant passing of servants, and the general overcrowding of castle life. To make matters worse, this pit wasn't just there for the staff to deal with. Sometimes the noble residents themselves were forced to use it. The proximity of these lavatories to public spaces means that aristocrats, their guests, and their servants alike might find themselves within an arm's reach of each other's waste. You can't help but cringe at the thought. And while many castles had multiple levels of these guard robes, each one essentially created a more potent form of medieval plumbing. Waste from the upper floors, flowing down to the lower levels until it reached the moat below. Here's where it gets really repulsive. The moat, which was designed as a defense mechanism to protect the castle from invaders, also doubled as a public waste disposal system. Think about it. The very moat that was meant to shield the castle from siege also became the place where the waste of the people inside the castle pooled. To add another layer of horror, people occasionally fished in these moats, sometimes even drinking from them. Yes, you read that correctly. People were essentially washing their hands and fetching drinking water from the same moat that served as an open-air cesspool for human and animal waste. You breathe in deeply, attempting to push the image from your mind, but it lingers. This is the truth of medieval life in the castle. To make matters worse, nobles didn't even think of keeping their guardrobes clean. The job fell to the night soil men, those unfortunate souls tasked with emptying the waste pits. Some historians suggest that these workers were either underpaid or possibly compensated with little more than a handful of blessings and a life filled with trauma. Imagine the humiliation of being a night soil man, tasked with cleaning the waste of the wealthy. It's not just the smell that would be unbearable. It's the very knowledge that your life's purpose revolved around the collection of waste. The records show that some castles had special trench-digging events where the waste pits were emptied into nearby rivers or forests. And when these pits were cleared, it wasn't an organized sanitation effort. No, it was usually done only when the stench became so overwhelming that even the castle's noble residents could no longer ignore it. If you thought avoiding the guardrobes would keep you safe from the stench, you were mistaken. Castles were vast, drafty buildings packed with people, and the smell of humanity was an ever-present part of castle life. The kitchens, the great halls, the rooms where musicians, guards, jesters, and nobles congregated, they all shared the same air, and that air was filled with the smell of human sweat, cooking meat, unwashed bodies, and the food scraps that went uncollected. Feasts in the great halls added to the odor. Roasting meat, spilled wine, unwashed hands grabbing greasy platters, bones tossed on the floor, all while dogs circled underfoot, licking up whatever dropped. Without forks, everything was eaten with fingers or knives, and those fingers would wipe off on whatever fabric happened to be nearby. Often, the fabric was the clothing of another guest. Even more troubling, this fabric rarely saw the inside of a washing machine. So, there you have it. A chamber filled with noblemen and women, eating food with their hands, sharing the air with dogs, and wearing clothes that hadn't been washed in days, if not weeks. You wander down the hallway and find another unexpected horror. You've heard rumors, and now you see it firsthand. Some nobles stored their clothing near the guardrobes because, oddly enough, the smell of ammonia from the urine in the pit helped keep the moths away. The same room that you'd never dare go near because of the stench of human waste also became a place of fabric storage. You can't even begin to comprehend the madness of this reality. This is the same space where people kept their finest garments, the ones that would be worn during grand feasts and royal affairs. And yes, it gets worse. Some kings, like King Edward I of England, commissioned luxury guardrobes, complete with padded seats and windows overlooking gardens. Imagine the absurdity. An elegant chamber designed for a nobleman to sit comfortably while doing his business, while simultaneously being able to enjoy the view of a beautiful garden. It seems like an odd mix of comfort and pure filth. Yet somehow, in the medieval world, this was considered practical. As you stand there, trying to make sense of this, it dawns on you that this level of dysfunction was far from an isolated case. In fact, historians still debate how widespread these guard-robes really were in medieval castles. Did they exist in every castle, or were they a unique feature reserved for only the wealthiest and most powerful? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. But regardless of their prevalence, one thing is certain. These guard robes were a perfect reflection of the medieval obsession with convenience over hygiene and the willingness to live with the most appalling smells. You take one last look at the pit in front of you, trying to ignore the creeping nausea that rises in your throat. The guard robe, in all its disgusting glory, is just one more reminder of what medieval life truly entailed. The stench of humanity, waste, and decay permeates every corner of this castle. But somehow, in the midst of all of this, life goes on. You walk through the medieval streets, your hand clutching a bundle of dried herbs, the sharp scent of lavender filling your nostrils as you press it to your face. The town is barely visible through the haze, the air thick with smoke from burning the clothes and bedding of the recently deceased. You can't avoid it. The smell of death is everywhere, suffocating, clinging to the very walls and streets as if it's a living, breathing thing. There's something about this town that's off today, something more unsettling than usual. The Black Death has claimed countless lives, and with it, a new understanding of disease has swept across Europe, one that is rooted in superstition and fear. You try to avoid the waste that's been discarded in the street, the leftover refuse from a town on the brink of collapse. A man stumbles past, muttering to himself, blood at the corners of his mouth, a dull, rancid smell wafting off of him. You do your best not to breathe it in, but it's futile. The smell follows you, clings to your skin and hair, makes your stomach churn. You pause, a wave of nausea rushing over you, realizing with horror that this, the unmistakable stench of disease, is what death smells like. It's not poetic, it's not dramatic, it's just thick, foul, and pervasive. The kind of smell that makes your skin crawl and your gut twist. The worst part? It doesn't just fill the air. It lingers. At night, it seeps into your clothes, into your hair. The smell clings to you long after you've left the streets behind, long after you've sought shelter in your humble cottage. The fear and the sickness are here, and no amount of lavender or thyme can drive it away. Not even the sweet smell of rosemary will save you now. Historians still argue over whether the medieval obsession with the smell of plague was the result of deep-rooted superstition or the overwhelming sensory trauma of the time. Some believe that the emphasis on the stench of the disease led to public health measures like early quarantine laws and a drive for cleaner cities, while others suggest that this focus on the smell distracted from more practical measures, such as isolating the sick or controlling the spread of rats. Either way, it's undeniable that the stench of death left its mark on the medieval world. You can feel it in the air, in the suffocating weight of disease that presses in from all directions. As you walk, you notice something more disturbing. The fields that once smelled of wet hay and morning dew now reek of decay. The temporary graves, dug hastily by the survivors, are everywhere, and the earth, trampled so many times, no longer smells of soil. It smells of rot, of things that have been buried before their time. The realization hits you like a slap in the face. This is the smell of death. It's not some grand, dramatic conclusion that one can expect from a story. No, it's just sticky, putrid, and all-consuming, taking over everything, making it impossible to ignore. Night falls, and the scent of death still clings to you. You lie in your bed, wrapped in your threadbare blanket, staring at the ceiling. The fear, the disease, the smell, they all linger in your mind. You press your herb bundle to your face again, desperate for any relief, but it's in vain. It's not enough. And as you drift off to sleep, you can't help but wonder, is it just the smell that's killing everyone? Or is it something deeper? The air feels thick with the weight of it all, with the weight of everything that's been lost, everything that's been taken. The stench of death is inescapable. This is what life has become now. Life in the shadow of the Black Death, where the very air you breathe is filled with disease, with fear, with death. There's no escaping it. And even as the world around you crumbles, you begin to realize that it's not just the plague that's killing people. It's the way the disease has seeped into the very fabric of life. The stench has become so all-encompassing that it's impossible to separate the sickness from the world around you. The disease isn't just something that strikes at random. It's something that's built into the very environment you live in. The smell follows you everywhere. Even in your dreams, you smell it. The putrid, rotting air that seems to follow you into every corner of your consciousness. And it's not just the smell of death that haunts you. It's the fear that you might be next. The fear that even if you manage to escape the plague for now, it will find you eventually, like a shadow that you can't outrun. The air, thick with death, is now a constant reminder that survival is a matter of chance, not choice. The grandeur of medieval castles is undeniable. Towering turrets, thick stone walls, and banners flapping in the breeze paint a picture of nobility and wealth. You imagine walking through one of those grand halls, filled with feasting nobles and brooding portraits. It seems almost majestic, a place untouched by the horrors outside, a sanctuary in the midst of chaos. But as you step deeper into the heart of castle life, the reality begins to set in, and the grandeur fades away, revealing the less than glamorous truth of life in a medieval stronghold. Living in a castle, particularly if you have a fully functioning nose, comes with its own set of horrors. The peasantry may have lived in mud huts surrounded by manure, but the nobles? They had their own brand of aristocratic funk. And at the center of it all was the castle's most notorious invention, the garderobe. The name may sound fancy, like a wardrobe for fine silks, or a place where crushed rose petals are stored. But no, a garderobe is, in fact, the castle's toilet, and it's about as glamorous as it sounds. Imagine a glorified hole in the wall, sometimes enclosed and sometimes not, but always positioned in such a way that it emptied directly into the moat below. The idea of privacy? Not here. There was no plumbing, no dignity, and certainly no way to escape the smell. The bench where people sat was sometimes made of wood, sometimes stone, and often perched right off a hallway, or tucked away in a small chamber with a window for air circulation. But let's not kid ourselves. There was no air circulation to speak of. Instead, the smell of decaying waste swirled through the stone corridors, like a permanent resident. The worst part? If you were unlucky enough to live in a multi-story castle, your waste would drop down to join that of the people above, creating what can only be described as a medieval sewer system. No pipes, no flushing, just waste cascading into a pit below, eventually finding its way into the very moat that was supposed to protect the castle from invaders. That's right. Your noble fortress's protective moat was also a cesspool of human filth. Not quite the fairy tale setting you imagined, huh? And if you think that's bad, just wait. It gets worse. Some castles had multiple guardrobes stacked vertically, with each level's waste tumbling down into a single pit or trench. This created the equivalent of a medieval plumbing system, but without the cleanliness or hygiene standards that would make modern people's stomachs turn. Even if you were fortunate enough to avoid the guardrobe, you weren't out of the woods. Castles were huge, drafty, and packed with people. Servants, guards, musicians, visiting dignitaries, and all the other types who contributed to the daily stench. The great halls may have looked grand with their roaring fires, massive tapestries, and flickering torchlight. But the reality is that you were sitting in a room where the walls trapped heat, smoke, and body odor. It was like being stuck in a glorified oven, and not the kind with fresh bread cooking in it. No, this was a Dutch oven of nobility, where food, sweat, and the lack of personal hygiene mixed to create an atmosphere that would be unbearable to modern sensibilities. Add a feast to the mix, and you're in for a truly unpleasant experience. Roasting meats, spilled wine, unwashed hands grabbing at greasy platters. It's a sensory overload, but not in a good way. No forks yet, so it's all fingers and knives, wiping off grease on the nearest fabric. And the best part? That fabric probably hadn't been washed in ages. Now let's get back to the guardrobe for a moment. Some nobles, in their infinite wisdom, thought it a good idea to store their fine clothes near the latrine. Why? Because the smell of ammonia from the urine supposedly kept the moths away. Yes, you read that right. The same room that made you gag from the smell of excrement was also where your precious silks and velvets were stored. The stench might be unbearable, but at least your clothes wouldn't be eaten by moths, right? And here's a fun historical tidbit. King Edward I of England was said to have commissioned a luxury guardrobe for his own use. This version came complete with a padded seat and a small window overlooking the garden. A throne fit for a king, indeed. But let's not forget the real purpose of this particular royal commode. It was for depositing waste directly into the moat. I suppose if you're royalty, you can make anything sound luxurious, even a toilet that doubled as a dump into a stagnant cesspool. Historians still argue about how common these guardrobes were in castles, with some scholars suggesting they've been overly romanticized, while others maintain that they were a real and widely used part of castle life. One thing is for sure, though. Castles were not the clean, pristine retreats you may have imagined. Even the wealthiest, most powerful people in medieval society had to deal with the realities of human waste and the overwhelming stench it created. Imagine walking to the guardrobe after a lavish dinner, your shoes squelching on damp flagstones as you make your way to the latrine. You try to avoid breathing through your nose, but it's impossible. The smell is everywhere. Even if you managed to avoid the guardrobe altogether, there was still the risk of accidentally falling into the waste pit. This wasn't some nightmare scenario. It actually happened. Some unlucky servants, and occasionally even drunk guests, met their end this way. It was a tragic way to go, but in the medieval world, it was a real hazard. As you walk back to your chamber after your unfortunate trip to the guardrobe, you reflect on the castle life you're stuck in. You've just eaten, and yet the smell of the banquet still clings to you. Sweat, smoke, and the heavy odor of overcooked meat. You climb into your bed, wrapped in moth-eaten furs, and try to block out the reality of your situation. The castle may be grand in its own way, but you're still sharing it with more than just your fellow nobles. You're sharing it with the smells, the filth, and the waste that no amount of wealth or grandeur can escape. You awake to the smell of dampness, a stale, wet odor that clings to the stone walls of your home. It's a scent you've learned to ignore over the years. But on mornings like these, it seems particularly unbearable. Your eyes open slowly, your body heavy from the weight of yesterday's labor. You're not alone in this house. The sounds of footsteps echo in the hall as the day begins. Somewhere outside, the dogs are barking, and you hear the distant sounds of livestock. Your stomach rumbles, but you try to ignore it. The smell of your surroundings has become so normal that it barely registers anymore. But today, it feels different. You take in the faint sense of wood smoke, damp hay, and something more subtle, a decay that lingers at the edges of your nostrils. You know what it is, but it doesn't seem to bother you the way it once did. It's not an unusual smell in this village. There's no shortage of it. The streets are littered with the waste of both animals and people, and no amount of sweeping can truly clear the air. You step out of your bed, your feet hitting the cold stone floor. It's early, too early for most, but you're used to it. The village doesn't sleep, and neither do you. You head toward the hearth, where embers are still burning faintly. The fire from last night is struggling to stay alive, but you manage to stir it back to life, adding a few pieces of firewood. You can smell the smoky char of the wood and the faint, lingering odor of animal fat. This is your world, dirty, bustling, alive with the smells of life itself. But somewhere beneath it all is the smell of death. A scent you can't quite place, but that lingers around every corner, like a shadow you can't quite shake off. It's subtle, like a reminder that this life is fragile. Some days, it's overwhelming, like the entire village is wrapped in the miasma of disease and decay. As you step out into the morning air, the smells of the village hit you full force. The streets are narrow, the houses crammed together. People walk in and out of their homes, and the air is thick with the smell of sweat, animal dung, and the faintest hint of rotting food. The marketplace, just up ahead, is already alive with activity. The butcher is setting out his wares, and the fishmonger is arranging his catch. Still slick with the moisture of the morning, you know that most of this food was preserved in salt or vinegar. But you don't think about that as you pass. You've learned to ignore the way the smell of spoiled meat lingers in the air, mixing with the scent of burning fat and fresh bread. Historians still argue about the full impact of the medieval stench. Some believe that the pervasive smells of decay and filth helped keep people sick and on edge, a constant reminder of how close they were to death. Others argue that medieval people were so used to the smell of their surroundings that they simply grew numb to it, adapting over time to a world that always smelled like it was teetering on the edge of decay. In fact, the idea that people simply didn't notice the stench is not as far-fetched as it may seem. In a world without modern hygiene, the human nose adapted. It became used to things that we today would find unbearable. But the truth is, the smell of decay and disease was everywhere. It was in the streets, in the air, and in the food. You walk through the market, avoiding the puddles of water and mud. The smell of manure is thick in the air as a cart full of horses passes by, leaving a trail of wet earth and waste. It's all so familiar, like the smell of home. Yet beneath that, there's something else, a heavier scent that weighs down on you, a reminder that the world isn't as it should be. You turn a corner, and the stench becomes more concentrated. The local tanner's shop is just ahead, and the smell of the tanning process hits you in the face, sharp and pungent. You cover your nose with your sleeve, but it's no use. The scent has soaked into everything, into the walls of the buildings, the streets, and even into the very air you breathe. As you continue through the village, you're reminded of how these smells have shaped everything. In some ways, it's as though the entire town is wrapped in a constant layer of smell. It affects everything: the food, the clothes, the people themselves. No one can escape it. Even those who try to stay clean, who take care to wash their hands or wear fresh clothes, are still part of this world. The stench seeps in everywhere, in ways that cannot be avoided. At the center of the village, you pause for a moment, noticing the way the marketplace is starting to crowd. The air is thick with voices, laughter, and the familiar hustle and bustle of daily life. But of course, there's always that underlying smell, a constant, steady presence. Even as you look around, seeing familiar faces, you know that the world they live in is shaped by something darker, something less tangible, but always present. The smell of decay is a constant companion in the medieval world, and it's not just the scent of death, it's the scent of life, too. As you make your way through the village, something catches your eye. The towering structure of the castle looming in the distance. It's impressive, with its tall turrets reaching for the sky, banners flapping in the wind, and stone walls that seem to whisper with history. You've been inside before, but each time, it feels just as awe-inspiring. The halls are grand, with chandeliers hanging overhead, and portraits of brooding nobility staring down at you from the walls. The sight of it all makes you feel small, a mere peasant in the presence of royalty. But there's something darker beneath the surface of these majestic walls. You might think that living in a castle would mean luxury, cleanliness, and order. But in the medieval world, comfort was not a given, especially when it came to the most basic of human functions. The rich might live in stone towers with grand feasts and beautiful tapestries, but they also had their own unique brand of misery. This misery, as you may have guessed, revolves around a place known as the garderobe. At first glance, a garderobe sounds like something fine and noble, a place to store expensive clothes or precious family heirlooms, perhaps. But no, the garderobe was, in fact, a glorified toilet. In fact, it was often little more than a hole in the wall or a crude seat perched over a shaft. It wasn't just a private affair either. These toilets were often placed right off busy hallways or tucked into corners where anyone could see or smell what was happening inside. Can you imagine? A place where royalty and nobles sat in the same chamber where servants and common folk passed by, with no privacy and no escape from the stench. These toilets weren't just an inconvenience. They were a source of shame, discomfort, and quite frankly, horror. The waste from these makeshift latrines often emptied directly into the moat, which, instead of serving as a protective barrier against invaders, doubled as a cesspool. The same water that was supposed to keep the castle safe from enemy forces also carried away the filth from their own waste. And if that wasn't enough, sometimes the pit was simply a trench, open and exposed, creating an olfactory nightmare for anyone who had the misfortune of passing by. Historians still debate just how common these guardrobes were in castles versus simpler solutions like chamber pots or outhouses. Some argue that the more majestic, romanticized version of the guardrobe, one with padded seats and small windows for a view of the garden, was more of a rare luxury than a standard feature. Still, there's no denying that many castles were built with a crude, no-frills approach to sanitation. The waste was left to fester in open pits or shallow trenches until the stench became unbearable. And when it did, the night soil men, as they were called in to deal with it. Their job was not glamorous, removing the accumulated waste, stirring it when necessary, and sometimes even digging new trenches to accommodate more filth. You can't help but wonder, what was it like to live in these conditions? To walk past the guardrobe, smell the waste, and continue on your way as if it were just another part of life? These toilets weren't cleaned regularly, and the air around them was thick with ammonia, decay, and filth. Even if you avoided the guardrobe itself, you still had to contend with the stench that permeated the castle's stone halls. You were never far from the reminder that your home, no matter how grand, was also a place of decay and death. Even if you were a noble, you weren't exempt from the smell. You could be sitting in a grand dining hall, feasting on roasted meats and drinking expensive wine, but the air around you was still thick with the aroma of body odor, sweat, and smoke. It didn't matter how polished the floors were, or how expensive the tapestries hanging on the walls. If the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and excrement, you were still living in a world of stench. And let's not forget about the bedchambers. The noble class had their own problems with bedding. Their mattresses, stuffed with straw, feathers, or dried moss, were no better than the ones you slept on. They might have been embroidered with fine fabrics and adorned with precious metals, but they too were home to fleas, lice, and other unwelcome guests. You might think that wealth and status would afford you comfort, but instead, it only made the stench of decay more evident. The noble bed was shared with the same creatures that plagued the peasantry, and the bedding absorbed everything. The sweat, the food spills, the ale, and even the occasional bodily function. Some nobles did try to keep their beds cleaner, at least in the sense that they aired them out occasionally or added herbs like lavender to ward off the pests. But the reality was that cleanliness, especially when it came to personal hygiene, was not a priority in the medieval world. If you weren't dealing with the stench of a public latrine, you were likely navigating the odor of your own body and that of your peers. As you walk through the castle, you can't help but feel a little relieved to step outside into the fresh air. The stench of the guardrobe and the confined spaces inside the castle is replaced by the smells of the earth and the grass. But even the outdoors can't escape the medieval filth. The air outside is thick with the smell of manure, livestock, and the ever-present aroma of decay. You've learned to accept these smells as part of life in this time, just as you've learned to live with the scent of rotting food, unwashed bodies, and the lingering odor of the plague. There's a certain grim resilience to it all. The people of the medieval world didn't have the luxury of deodorants, air fresheners, or indoor plumbing. They didn't have the option to sanitize every corner of their world. They simply adapted. They lived in a state of perpetual exposure to the smells of decay and death. And while we might cringe at the thought of it today, for them, it was just part of life. It's been a long day, one filled with medieval sights, sounds, and, most importantly, smells. And now your stomach is reminding you of the one thing you've been ignoring all day: food. You can already picture the medieval feast that awaits: a hearty meal of bread, stew, and roasted meats, perhaps with a side of cheese and a cup of ale to wash it all down. But as you walk toward the kitchen, where the smell of simmering meals rises into the air, you know that what awaits you might not be the feast of your dreams. First, let's set the scene: the kitchen. You might expect something pristine: gleaming pots, tidy shelves, and well-washed linens. But not here. This is a medieval kitchen, a stinking, fire-drenched space where cooking is as much about survival as it is about feeding the household. The room is dimly lit by the flickering flames of an open hearth, with soot-streaked walls and a floor slick with old grease, flour dust, and whatever the dog brought in today. The smell of burnt cabbage mixes with the greasy aroma of boiling meats, a combination that is less than appetizing. Historians still argue whether medieval kitchens were truly as chaotic and unsanitary as we think. Some say that the higher-ranked kitchens in castles and abbeys were more organized, with designated cooks and servants handling the food. Others suggest that even in the wealthiest homes, kitchens were little more than chaotic spaces where food and filth were cooked side by side. Either way, you don't expect much cleanliness in this environment, especially when the food is prepared in large pots set over an open flame, a constant reminder that things get messy fast. As you step closer, you see the animals underfoot: chickens clucking, dogs circling, and maybe even a pig or two tied in the corner, its fate already sealed in the sizzling pot. It's not just the animals that cause the commotion. It's the people. The cooks are shouting instructions, scrambling to get the meal ready, while others try to sweep the floor of waste and leftovers. This, you realize, is the real smell of the medieval kitchen: a pungent mix of animal odor, smoke, and spoiled food. And that food? Well, it's not as fresh as you'd like to think. The meat, while roasting on the spit, has already been past its prime. It might have been butchered days ago, maybe even longer, and preserved with salt, smoke, or drying methods that, frankly, didn't always do the trick. Meat left to age in a medieval kitchen often became a mix of tangy, sour, and mysteriously meaty, often too far gone for most people's modern sensibilities, but still edible by the standards of the day. To mask the taste of spoiled meat, cooks would drown it in heavy spices: cinnamon, cloves, garlic, and vinegar. These potent additions not only enhanced the flavor, but also kept questions about the meat's quality to a minimum. The smell of rotting meat mixed with spice and vinegar is intoxicating, but not in a good way. It's as though the kitchen itself is telling you to stop asking questions and just eat. The trick was simple. You couldn't afford to waste food, so even if the meat was starting to turn, you simply seasoned it heavily and served it up. The idea of throwing away food wasn't even a consideration. Wasting anything, whether food, fuel, or water, was a luxury reserved for only the wealthiest. And then there's the fish. If you live inland, you know the smell before you even see it. The fish arrive days after the catch, salted, dried, and stored in barrels that haven't been cleaned since the last fishing trip. You can imagine the pungent, foul odor rising from these barrels, a mixture of salt, rot, and days-old fish, now a staple of the medieval diet. The fish may not be fresh, but they're a necessity, especially during fasting seasons when meat is off the menu. The stench of decaying fish, mixed with the overwhelming heat of the fire and the sweat of the workers, becomes something you can't escape. In the corner of the kitchen, someone is working with the cabbage pot, a bubbling mess of boiled vegetables that has likely been simmering for hours. The green leaves have turned a dull gray, and as you lean in, the smell nearly knocks you out. Cabbage, onions, turnips. These were the staples of the medieval diet for those who couldn't afford meat every day. But together, they create an aroma that is less than appetizing, especially when you add the subtle hint of mold from the old, unsanitary kitchenware. It's a smell that lingers long after the meal has been consumed. Then there's the bread, always a key component of the medieval meal. But this isn't the fluffy, yeasty bread you're used to. This is hard, dense, and often stale by the time it reaches your plate. The bread is baked once a week and has to last for days, even weeks. By day 5, it's already a little moldy and tough, but you slice it, toast it over the fire, and try not to think about the texture. The smell of burned bread and smoke is everywhere, and by the time it reaches your table, the sour scent is mingling with everything else, creating a near constant reminder of the harsh reality of medieval life. Some of the more adventurous cooks even used fake ingredients. You might see meatballs painted with saffron to make them look like golden fruit, or pies filled with live birds, just as the nursery rhyme suggests. It's all part of the medieval culinary world, a time when presentation mattered as much as taste, and where everything had to be disguised or covered up to mask the reality of what was being served. Historians still debate whether medieval food preparation was truly as unsafe as it sounds. Some argue that people in the Middle Ages had stronger digestive systems thanks to constant exposure to bacteria and microbes, while others point out that food poisoning was a constant problem. But one thing's for sure: the medieval diet wasn't for the faint of heart. The combination of bad meat, fish, and vegetables often left a lot to be desired, but the people had no choice. The food wasn't just about sustenance, it was about survival. Now, here you are, standing in the kitchen, your stomach growling as the cook hands you a bowl of the day's stew. It's a mix of meat, cabbage, and whatever vegetables are left over from yesterday. You dig in, using your fingers as the peasants have done for centuries. The taste is strong, pungent, and not entirely pleasant. But you're hungry. You swallow it down, ignoring the smell of the kitchen, the stale bread, and the moldy vegetables. You step outside into the cool night air, grateful for the fresh breeze that cuts through the oppressive heat of the kitchen. The smell of the village fills your nostrils: manure, burning wood, and the faint aroma of roasted meat wafting in the air. It's strange how everything seems to have its own smell here. Some good, some terrible, but all of it a part of life. After a day spent trudging through the chaos of medieval kitchens, plague pits, and the stench of everyday life, you find yourself heading towards something that's meant to be a bit more joyful. It's festival day, and the town square is already alive with music, chatter, and the promise of celebration. The weather is fair, and the usual worries are pushed aside in favor of community, food, and, of course, drinks. The scene is lively, almost surreal, as vendors set up their booths, the smell of roasting meats drifting on the air like a tantalizing promise. Colorful banners flap in the breeze, and people gather in groups, some dancing in circles, others gathered around makeshift tables to share a meal. The sounds of bagpipes, fiddles, and drums fill the air, their melodies competing with the laughter and shouting of townsfolk. The scene is festive, a temporary reprieve from the harshness of everyday life. You've seen feasts like this before. People laughing, drinking, dancing. But this time, there's something about the air, the heat of the crowd, the close quarters, and the smell of wet wool and sweat that fill the air. It's the smell of humanity, of long, hot days spent working the fields or laboring in the marketplace. You can already feel your nose protesting, but you know that the festival is more than just a social gathering. It's a release valve for the frustrations and hardships of everyday medieval life. The rich scent of roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and sweet pies wafts toward you, but it's mixed with the far less appealing smells of the crowd, the sweat and dirt of hundreds of people packed together, the faint odor of animal dung that clings to the ground beneath your feet, and the pungent smell of unwashed bodies. The air is thick with the smell of spilled ale, and you're not sure if it's the drink itself or the sweat and body odor that give off the stronger scent. In many ways, public festivals like this are a snapshot of medieval life. They're a time to forget the hardships, to eat and drink together, to let loose. But as you look around, you start to realize just how much the medieval world was defined by its smells. The festival goers, despite their best efforts, can't mask the odors of a life spent in close quarters with animals, sweat, and grime. You pass by a stall selling sweetmeats, honeyed almonds, and fried dough, but you can't help but notice the flies that have made themselves at home in the pastries. You politely pass, even though the smell of fresh food is tempting. Further along, someone hands you a cup of ale. It tastes vaguely of vinegar and socks, but you drink it anyway, because that's what everyone's doing. Then, the real fun begins. A man stumbles past you, his arms raised in the air as he cheers for no particular reason. You can't help but notice that he smells of something you can't quite place. Maybe a mix of unwashed clothes, stale ale, and something faintly animalistic. You try to avoid his personal space, but it's hard. There's nowhere to move, and the crowd is pressing in. Historians still argue about how much medieval people enjoyed these festivals versus how much they endured them out of obligation or tradition. Some believe these festivals were essential to medieval life, an outlet for the common folk to celebrate despite their hardships. Others claim that many people dreaded the overcrowding, the noise, the smell, and the chaos. Either way, the festivals happened, year after year, century after century. And people showed up, stinking, laughing, dancing, because what else were they going to do? The crowd continues to press forward, and you can't help but feel like you're losing your sense of self in the mass of humanity. Everyone's here for a good time, but it's a good time with a twist. A bit of chaos, a lot of sweat, and a whole lot of smell. People are walking barefoot in puddles of liquid you'd rather not think about. Children are running around with muddy feet and sticky hands. And the smell of horse manure lingers in the air, thanks to the number of animals walking freely through the crowd. The night drags on, the sun dipping lower in the sky, and the music shifts to a more drunken tone. People are dancing in circles now, their movements becoming more erratic, more careless. Someone stumbles and falls, knocking over a barrel of ale, spilling it into the mud. No one cares. They laugh, they shout, they press on, oblivious to the stench that has now become an integral part of the festival atmosphere. The smell of sweat, booze, urine, and burning wood fills the air, and you can't help but feel that the entire town has descended into a communal, almost primal release. At some point, the smell of the food becomes almost unbearable. Roasting meat mixes with the strong, musky odor of the crowd. The flies, having claimed their share of the food, are now settling in for the night. The pungency of the festival is all-consuming. It's like a layer of grime, one you can't escape. And yet, despite the overwhelming stench, you find yourself part of it, laughing, dancing, enjoying the chaos because it's the only thing that makes sense in a world where everything else smells like death. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you know that the night will end soon. The sounds will fade. The last of the drunk revelers will stumble home, and the firelight will flicker out. You'll walk back to your small cottage, your clothes and hair reeking of smoke, spilled alcohol, and sweat. But for now, you keep dancing, keep laughing, keep going, because this is the only escape from the stench of medieval life. As you stumble away from the crowd, finally escaping the worst of the smells, you can't help but wonder what it was like for people in the medieval world. How did they endure it? How did they live in a world that smelled this bad, day in and day out? And yet, somehow, they did. They adapted, they endured, and they continued to live in their own peculiar way, oblivious to the overwhelming smells that defined their world. As night settles over your medieval village, with the festival's aftertaste still lingering on your tongue, it's time to turn your attention toward another element of medieval life: the church, a place of sanctuary, prayer, and communal gathering. The church was meant to be the ultimate escape from the stench of the everyday world, a place where the air was supposedly cleaner, the air purer, and the smells, perhaps, more heavenly. The church itself is a large stone structure, its high ceilings looming above, filled with the smell of candles burning, the faint incense that drifts lazily through the air, and the lingering warmth of bodies pressed together in prayer. The moment you step through the wooden doors, the smell of beeswax candles and incense hits you. It's a welcome change from the stench outside, from the smells of animals, mud, and sweat. that you've been breathing in all day. But don't get too comfortable, because while the smell of incense may cover up some of the worst odors, it can't quite mask the reality of medieval life. You're in a building with hundreds of people, all packed together in close quarters, breathing the same stale air, wearing the same clothes, and rarely, if ever, washing. It's not long before the smell of unwashed bodies, sweaty tunics, and overripe wool fills the air, mixing with the faint scent of incense. It's an odd contrast, a smell that is meant to be divine, spiritual, and holy, but with the unmistakable undertones of very earthly, very human realities. Historians still argue whether medieval churches smelled better than the homes and streets of the common folk. On one hand, religious orders like the monks and nuns were supposed to adhere to cleanliness as part of their spiritual practice. They fasted, prayed, and performed rituals of purification. But on the other hand, there were still the very human realities of body odor, sweat, and the pervasive smell of bodies that hadn't seen a bath in weeks, if not months. Monks, in particular, were known for their dedication to their spiritual lives, but unfortunately, their hygiene was not as rigorously attended to as their prayers. The typical monk's habit was made of wool, and while it was practical and warm, it was rarely washed. In fact, many monasteries forbade bathing altogether, with some monks only permitted to bathe during the Easter season. This holiness through discomfort approach may have been meant to bring them closer to God, but the result was a space that smelled like damp wool, body odor, and stale ale. The church, as a building, was not much better. The lack of proper ventilation meant that the air, thick with the fumes of incense and sweat, was often stagnant. The stone floors were cold and damp, and the straw mattresses that monks slept on only added to the pungent smell that lingered in the air. While incense was used to purify the space, it had a limited effect on the smell of bodies that had spent the better part of the day in the same garments. The air grew heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies, fermented prayer, and the faint odor of stale wine from the communion goblet. As you sit through the prayers, trying to focus on the holy words being spoken, you can't help but notice the people around you. The man next to you smells faintly of fish, while the woman across from you has an odor of sour ale wafting from her robes. But everyone is here to worship, to find spiritual solace, and to escape the noise and the filth of the world. Yet, no matter how many incense burners are lit, or how much myrrh is burned, there is no escaping the reality of life in the Middle Ages. The church may be a sanctuary for the soul, but it's not immune to the basic smells of humanity. While many religious practices centered on spiritual purification, the reality of personal hygiene was often overlooked. The ritual of washing the feet of the poor was one such example, an effort to purify the body, even if the whole body wasn't bathed. For most people, the concept of personal cleanliness was an afterthought, a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford. And even they, the aristocracy, were not exempt from the occasional odor, particularly if they spent their days running through the dirt and mud of their estates, riding horses, or attending feasts. You could almost say that they were the best-smelling people in town. But that's not saying much in the context of the overwhelming stench that permeated medieval life. And then, of course, there were the pilgrims, those who traveled from holy site to holy site, seeking divine favor, redemption, or salvation. They arrived at churches covered in dust and dirt, their feet raw from walking miles of rough roads, their bodies caked with sweat and grime. For them, the church was a place of both spiritual and physical relief. But for those already there, the odor of pilgrimage became just another part of the church's atmosphere. The monks tended to the pilgrims, sometimes by the hundreds. But even in this sacred space, there was no escaping the realities of bodily fluids, sweat, and the constant threat of disease. You can almost hear the echoes of the monks' chants as they fill the air with their solemn prayers. But even those are tinged with the heaviness of the stench that surrounds you. You look around at the other faces, their eyes glazed over, lost in prayer, while their bodies continue to breathe the same air, the scent of incense, the smell of bodies, the musk of wool, and the undercurrent of sweat. It's a strange mixture, one that you'll never forget. As you trudge through the streets of your medieval village, a strange sense of discomfort settles in. The air smells of sweat, manure, and decaying food, mingling with the earthy, pungent scents of the animals in the yards. The cobbled streets are slick with mud, and you feel the weight of the day's dirt on your body. It's not just the grime under your fingernails or the smell of your own sweat that bothers you. It's the realization that personal cleanliness in the Middle Ages was an elusive dream. While the rich may have had more resources, everyone was trapped in the same grimy routine, unable to escape the stench of their everyday lives. Medieval hygiene was an odd mix of folk remedies, desperation, and superstition. Bathing, which is a ritual many modern people take for granted, was a luxury in your world. While you might hear the occasional whisper of a public bathhouse in some towns, these were few and far between. In many places, taking a bath was a rare occasion, reserved for special moments, perhaps once a year if you were lucky. It was said that the rich would have personal bathing attendants, but for most, the idea of cleanliness was a much more casual affair. In your village, there were no luxury soaps, no foamy bubbles, and certainly no hot showers. The closest you would get to a clean body was a quick dip in the river, which wasn't much better than the pond full of stagnant water that served as the town's unofficial pool. Even then, there was no guarantee the water was free of bacteria, insects, or waste. You could scrub your body with sand or rough cloths, but it would only go so far. The dirt and grime would always come back, and the smell? Well, that would linger. But even if you couldn't escape the smell of your own body, you could at least mask it. Medieval people, ever creative, concocted herbal remedies and solutions to combat the stench that permeated their lives. Lavender, rosemary, thyme. These were the most common fragrances used to cover the natural odors that clung to the body. Bundles of these herbs were tied to your belt, tucked into your clothes, or placed on your pillow at night. They weren't magic, but they provided a temporary distraction from the overwhelming smell of sweat and decay. Historians still argue whether this herbal perfume was a necessity for survival or a simple matter of status. The wealthy, after all, could afford better-smelling herbs, while the poor made do with whatever they could find. They might wear lavender on their collars or tuck rosemary into their boots. In some places, it was even considered fashionable. Still, the reality was that no amount of sage or lavender could hide the pervasive stench of medieval life. In many ways, it was a futile attempt to deny the basic truth. People smelled bad because they couldn't wash. Washing clothes was just as difficult. Woolen garments made to withstand the cold were often worn year after year, rarely cleaned. The rich might have laundry staff, but for the poor, washing was a back-breaking chore. Water had to be fetched from a well, and it was rare to have enough to wash all your clothing. Wool shrank if boiled, so instead, people would air out their garments, beating them with sticks or hanging them on a line. The task was performed in the hopes that it would remove some of the dirt, but it was never fully effective. And then, there was the hair. Medieval people's hair was frequently unkempt and greasy, not because they didn't care, but because shampoo was something yet to be invented. Some used lye soap to clean their hair, but that too had its dangers. The hair would become brittle, rough, and sometimes even fall out. A good brush could help tame the wild tangles, but brushing didn't do much for the smell. The best you could do was oil it, or if you had access to a wealthier family's resources, rub it with herbs that you hoped would hide the scent. Despite all these attempts at cleanliness, there was a sense of resignation that you couldn't escape. You couldn't outrun the smell of the livestock you tended, the manure you spread, or the market where you bought your food. The constant proximity to waste, both human and animal, meant that hygiene was, at best, a fleeting goal. But in some strange way, the medieval people were able to adapt to it. They grew accustomed to the stink of their world and didn't even realize the full extent of it. To them, it was normal. They might have tried to mask it, but in the end, they simply lived with it. Still, there were moments of hope, of fleeting cleanliness, when the smell was bearable. Perhaps when the sun rose over the hills, or when the flowers bloomed, and you would catch a glimpse of fresh air before the stench of the market overwhelmed it. And when the rain came, washing away some of the filth from the streets, there was a brief moment of respite, a small promise that there was, perhaps, more to life than simply enduring the smell. For the poor, this was the reality. You lived with it, learned to ignore it, and carried on. For the nobility, however, things were slightly different. They had access to better food, better clothes, and better resources. But even they could never truly escape the stench of medieval life. As the shadows stretch across the room and the warmth of the fire flickers low, the chaotic rhythm of the day begins to fade. The world outside has settled into a hushed stillness, the air crisp and quiet, as though the earth itself is winding down. In this moment, you let go of the stench, the weight, the constant hustle of existence. The air in your room smells faintly of the herbs you tucked into your clothes earlier, the lavender and rosemary still lingering in the folds. It's not the freshest scent, but it's grounding, calming, a gentle reminder of the simple things that make life bearable in this medieval world. The faint musk of the straw bed beneath you is a far cry from the soft, sanitized comfort of modern life. But here, it's part of the rhythm. It's how you know you're alive. The warmth of the fire and the coolness of the stone beneath you mix together, and for a moment, it feels as though the world is suspended in this perfect stillness. Your body, tired from the day, relaxes. The muscles in your back and shoulders soften, releasing the tension that had built up through the noise. the smells, the endless movements. You may not be clean by modern standards. Your body may carry the weight of the day, of the smells, of the mess. But in this quiet, in this moment, there's peace. The stillness of the room wraps around you like a blanket. There's a hum in the air, a gentle vibration of the world that seems to breathe with you. It's as though the earth itself is sighing with relief that for now, the storm has passed. And so, you let yourself sink deeper into the bed, the scratch of the straw mattress against your skin, no longer uncomfortable, but familiar. You close your eyes and take in the quiet, the soft crackling of the embers in the hearth, the occasional creak of the wooden beams above. Everything is still. Everything is soft. As the night deepens, the air grows cooler, and your thoughts begin to slow. Your body relaxes into the rhythm of breathing, in and out, soft and steady. The day is done. You've faced its mess, its challenges, its smells. And now you are here, in the peace of your own room, your own world, a world filled with scents, sounds, and memories. But for now, only calm remains. Let your breath become slower, softer. Let your body rest into the quiet, into the simplicity of being. You've survived the day. You've lived through the mess and the chaos. And now you can let go. So as your body relaxes, let the night hold you. Let the quiet embrace you. The world outside will wait until tomorrow. For tonight, you are safe. You are here. Now, drift deeper into sleep. Let it carry you into the silence where you don't need to smell, to struggle, or to rush. Just rest